The first thing a German fighter pilot noticed was not the bomber stream. He had seen that before, silver specks stacked into layers, crawling east with the stubbornness of a machine that did not feel fear. What stopped him cold was what hung above them, higher than the contrails, keeping station where no escort was supposed to be.
Sleek fighters, close, patient, and still there, deep in the Reich.
For months, the Jagdwaffe had lived by a simple rhythm: wait for the Americans to come, let their escorts run out of fuel, then tear into the bombers like wolves into a wounded herd. But now the rhythm was breaking. And in the breaking, something else appeared, a quiet truth the Luftwaffe did not want to say out loud. Meanwhile in England before dawn, the airfields of East Anglia were already awake. Engines coughed and caught, then settled into a hard, vibrating growl. Ground crews moved like silhouettes in floodlights, hands numb with cold, fingers working safety pins, fuel lines, ammunition belts. There was the smell of high-octane gas and exhaust, the sharp bite of hydraulic fluid, the clatter of metal panels being latched shut. And above it all, a sound that had become the signature of America's war in Europe, the slow thunder of heavy bombers warming up one by one, a field of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators preparing to rise. In 1943, the Americans believed they had found a way to win the air war with daylight precision. The theory was bold, almost mathematical: fly in tight formations, saturate the sky with defensive guns, and use accurate bombing to dismantle German industry piece by piece. Where the Royal Air Force had moved to night bombing after brutal losses, the U.S. Army Air Forces insisted the day belonged to them. They would go in, hit the target, and come home. The bomber, they believed, could defend itself. For German fighter pilots, that confidence was not inspiring.
It was an invitation.
The trap the Luftwaffe had already built. By mid-1943, the defense of the Reich had evolved into something grimly efficient. Radar warning and ground control could direct fighters toward incoming formations. Luftwaffe units learned the American routes and timing. And most important of all, they learned to exploit a simple mechanical limit: fuel. American escorts, in those early deep raids, could not stay with the bombers all the way in. They escorted to the edge of Germany, maybe a bit farther, and then they had to turn back. That turn back point became a line in the sky, invisible but understood on both sides. On one side of it, the bomber crews felt the comforting presence of friendly fighters. On the other side, they entered a different world, one where the horizon was hostile and the air itself seemed occupied. If you want a date that captures how sharply this reality cut, look to August 17, 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. Two separate forces of B-17s struck high-value targets deep inside Germany, including aircraft factories and ball-bearing works. The targets mattered. The route mattered more. The bomber stream stretched so far that escort coverage was uneven, and at times absent. Historical accounts describe P-47 Thunderbolt escorts that were simply too short-legged in that period to stay with the bombers once they crossed into Germany. The result was predictable and terrifying: sustained fighter attacks on formations that could not outrun, outclimb, or outturn their attackers. Then came October 14, 1943, the second major strike on Schweinfurt, a day remembered in American history as Black Thursday. The numbers alone tell you what it felt like. Of 291 B-17s sent, 77 did not return, roughly a quarter of the force. Crews who survived would describe skies filled with flak bursts and fighters slashing through formation gaps, the kind of battle where you do not have time to be brave because you are too busy staying alive. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm did not see these raids as clean, surgical operations. They saw them as a kind of harvest. German fighter pilots, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns, developed tactics tailored to the moment. They attacked from head-on, where closure speed was high and defensive gun arcs were tighter. They coordinated passes, used altitude and sun, and sometimes brought in twin-engine heavy fighters like the Bf-110 or Me-410 to fire rockets or cannon from outside the tightest defensive range. Even when those heavy fighters suffered, they still served a purpose: forcing the bomber formation to break, to throw off gunners, to create the openings that single-engine fighters could exploit. And every time an American escort turned back, German pilots could feel the odds shift. This was not arrogance. It was pattern recognition. In 1943, the Luftwaffe believed that the Americans could be bled white, not because the Germans were unaware of American industrial power, but because crews were not machines.
Aircraft could be built.
Experienced bomber crews could not be manufactured overnight. There were only so many men who could keep a crippled B-17 in the air with one engine on fire, over a country that wanted to kill them. There were only so many who could hold formation while flak punched holes in wings and fuselage, while friends disappeared in smoke. So the German logic became simple: if we can keep forcing the Americans into these deep raids without full escort, the cost will eventually become politically, psychologically, operationally unbearable. From a German cockpit, it looked like a plan that might actually work. Why the escorts had to leave. To understand why the escorts could not stay, you have to imagine the escort mission as a fuel problem wrapped in an engineering problem wrapped in a doctrinal argument. The P-47 Thunderbolt was rugged, fast in a dive, and heavily armed. It could take punishment and keep flying. But early in the campaign, its effective escort radius was limited. The P-38 Lightning had twin engines and long-range potential, but it faced its own challenges in the European environment, especially in very cold high-altitude conditions and in the specific tactical demands of escorting heavy bombers deep into Germany. These fighters could escort, but not enough, not far enough, not consistently enough. The US answer was not simply build a better fighter. It was build a better system. That system would include a new escort aircraft, yes, but also drop tanks, changes in command philosophy, better coordination, and an aggressive shift in how fighters were used. In other words, it was not just a plane that changed the war.
It was a decision.
In 1943, that decision had not yet fully arrived.
And so the bomber crews flew into the gap.
You can almost hear the moment in the radio chatter, the point when escorts call they are low on fuel, turning for home.
Bomber gunners watch them peel away.
They try not to look at the empty sky ahead.
They know what waits there.
Luftwaffe pilots know it too, and they are already climbing. The Americans tried workarounds. They experimented with gunship escorts, like the YB-40 concept, heavily armed bombers meant to fly with a formation and fend off fighters. In practice, such solutions struggled with the physics of speed, fuel consumption, and formation dynamics. They were symptoms of a deeper truth. The bomber needed a true long-range guardian. The Mustang enters the story, quietly at first.
The North American P-51 Mustang S origin story did not begin as a triumphant American legend.
It began with urgency and improvisation, with British requirements and American manufacturing. Early Mustangs used an Allison engine and showed promise, particularly at lower altitudes. But the air war over Europe demanded excellence high above, where heavy bombers lived, where the air was thin and cold and unforgiving. The Mustang became truly transformative when mated to the Rolls-Royce Merlin design, built in the United States by Packard. Suddenly, the aircraft had the high-altitude performance to match its aerodynamic efficiency. But performance alone was not enough. The war's most important question remained: could it stay with the bombers? Here is where a seemingly mundane object becomes decisive: the drop tank. A drop tank is an external fuel tank carried under a wing or belly, designed to be jettisoned when empty. In concept, it is simple. In wartime reality, it is complicated. It must be safe, reliable, aerodynamic enough not to cripple performance, and mass-producible in numbers that match operational need. It must integrate with plumbing and fuel management systems in a way that pilots can trust in combat. And it must arrive on time, to the units that need it. By late 1943, Mustangs began entering combat service with American units in Europe, and by early 1944 they would become more common in the 8th Air Force. The P-51B and P-51C models, with a Merlin engine and the ability to carry external fuel, were the version that mattered for the crisis of escort range. Still, the Mustang did not instantly flip the war like a switch. It entered a system already strained, with doctrines and habits formed in blood. Bomber commanders had learned to keep escorts close, almost leashed to the formation, because the bombers had suffered whenever fighters wandered too far. Escort commanders, for their part, were torn between the instinct to protect and the desire to hunt. Everyone could see the same sky. They simply disagreed on what a fighter was for. That argument would not stay theoretical.
A change in leadership, a change in purpose.
In January 1944, leadership in the American Air War shifted in a way that seems subtle on paper but profound in practice. Major General James "Jimmy" Doolittle, already famous for the Tokyo raid, assumed command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was not the kind of commander who accepted a system just because it existed. He came with a different philosophy and a different appetite for risk. There is a story recorded in historical writing about this period that captures Doolittle's mindset.
Visiting 8th Fighter Command, Doolittle saw a slogan on the wall.
It read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." It was a sentence born of trauma, a motto written in the ink of Schweinfurt and Regensburg.
Doolittle had it taken down.
His reasoning was cold, strategic, and ultimately ruthless. If the escort fighters were chained to the bombers forever, the Luftwaffe could choose when and where to fight. The Americans would always be reacting. The escorts needed to do more than shield. They needed to break the German fighter force itself. In other words, the bomber offensive could not succeed unless the Luftwaffe was destroyed, and the Luftwaffe could not be destroyed unless American fighters were allowed to hunt. This is where the P-51 Mustang becomes more than a machine. Its range, especially when combined with external fuel tanks, made Doolittle's philosophy executable. A fighter that could escort deep into Germany could also roam ahead, sweep enemy airspace, attack fighters as they formed up, follow them down, and punish them on the return. It could turn the German defense from an ambush into a running battle. German pilots had long treated the escort limit as a natural boundary. Doolittle and the Mustang threatened to erase that boundary. And if that boundary disappeared, the entire German strategy of bleeding the bomber force would have to change. But no one on either side could truly know how it would play out until it was tested under the harshest conditions possible. Before the Mustang, the Luftwaffe had confidence. It is important to understand the psychology of the Jagdwaffe in 1943. Many German fighter pilots did not believe the American bomber campaign was invincible. They had seen bombers fall. They had learned how to attack them. They had watched American formations shatter when escorts left and fighters came in waves. They had confidence not just in their flying, but in their system, the ability to mass fighters against bombers at the critical point. Even the way the Germans talked about the American approach carried a kind of contempt. The bomber stream was predictable. The route planning, the rendezvous, the timing, the way a formation could not easily maneuver without breaking itself apart. From a fighter pilot's point of view, it could feel like hunting trains rather than dueling swordsmen. And then, slowly, new silhouettes started showing up.
At first, the Mustang could be mistaken for just another escort.
Something sleek, perhaps even pretty, compared to the brute shapes of other fighters. Some Luftwaffe pilots, seeing it at a distance, might not immediately understand what made it dangerous. The sky was full of aircraft, recognition at speed was imperfect, rumor traveled faster than confirmed fact. But what the Germans did notice, and quickly, was endurance. The Mustang did not turn back when expected. It did not peel away at the old line in the sky. It stayed with the bombers, and sometimes it went ahead, as if it owned the airspace. That was the true shock. Not that a new fighter existed, but that it had broken a rule the Germans thought was permanent.
The beginning of the end of the escort gap.
By early 1944, the American air war was preparing for an escalation that would force a decision. The campaign later remembered as Big Week, a concentrated series of attacks aimed at the German aircraft industry and the Luftwaffe's ability to replace losses. The concept was straightforward: hit the factories, hit the airfields, and compel the German fighter arm to rise in defense, where it could be worn down. But the deeper logic was more personal than strategic diagrams. If German fighters could be drawn up and destroyed, the bombers could survive. If the bombers could survive, Germany's industrial heart could be pounded day after day. If Germany's industry could be pounded relentlessly, the war's trajectory would tilt. For the Luftwaffe, this was also a contest of attrition, but with a different imbalance. Germany could not replace pilots and machines at the rate America could. It could not afford to trade aircraft one for one indefinitely. It needed efficient kills. It needed the bomber offensive to become unsustainable. In this tightening spiral of logic, the Mustang was a dagger aimed at Germany's most fragile asset, trained fighter pilots. And yet, even as these pieces moved into place, there was still uncertainty. Range alone did not guarantee victory. Mustangs could escort, yes, but they would still have to fight. They would have to face experienced German pilots in Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, aircraft that were deadly in the hands of men defending their homeland. They would have to work in coordination with bombers under stress, through flak corridors, in bad weather, over a country whose very landscape had been transformed into a defense grid. There was also the human factor. A pilot with external fuel tanks is still a pilot making choices: when to drop the tanks, when to engage, when to break off, when to chase. Those decisions would determine whether the Mustang's promise became reality or just another entry in the list of wartime hopes. But in the winter of 1944, the United States was ready to bet on this new combination of machine and doctrine. The stage was set for the moment that German pilots had privately assumed would never come: American escort fighters, not just near the German border, not just over the Ruhr, but pressing all the way toward the heart of the Reich, turning what used to be a safe retreat route into a corridor of danger. And soon, the ultimate symbol of that reach would appear on briefing maps with a single word that carried both fear and obsession. In the winter of 1944, the skies over Europe stopped behaving like a predictable equation. For months, both sides had learned a cruel routine. The Americans came in daylight with box formations of B-17s and B-24s, bright and disciplined, their .50 caliber guns bristling like porcupine spines. The German fighters rose in waves, timed and directed, waiting for the escorts to peel away, because they always peeled away. Somewhere over western Germany, the American little friends would turn back toward England, and the bomber crews would feel the temperature of the war change instantly. Beyond that invisible line, the Luftwaffe believed it owned the air. Then, slowly at first, that line began to dissolve. Not with a dramatic announcement, not with a single battle where the world suddenly flipped, but with small, stubborn signs that kept repeating: American fighters still there, still close, still waiting above the bombers when German pilots expected them to be gone. And beneath those fighters, hanging under the wings like blunt, ungainly luggage, were the objects that made the impossible suddenly practical. External fuel tanks that could be dropped when empty and replaced before the next mission.
Drop tanks.
They look almost trivial compared to the guns, the engines, the polished aluminum, the heroic silhouettes in posters. But in the air war over Germany, drop tanks helped turn escort fighters into something the Luftwaffe had not planned for: hunters with stamina. The decision that changed what fighters were allowed to be. When Lieutenant General James Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he inherited a crisis of attrition and morale, and a deep argument about how to use fighters. He was stepping into a war where bomber crews had already watched friends vanish over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, and where commanders had learned to cling to the escorts as if the fighters were life rafts. There is an anecdote that appears again and again in the historical record because it captures the pivot in one sharp moment. Doolittle visited Major General William Kepner at 8 Fighter Command and noticed a sign. It read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." According to Doolittle's own telling, he ordered Kepner to take down that damned sign and replace it with a new one. "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." Those words weren't bravado. They were strategy, and they were ruthless. If the Germans were allowed to keep launching mass interceptions, if they could keep choosing the moment of attack, then the bomber force would continue to bleed. The only way out was to break the Jagdwaffe itself, to force German fighters into fights they couldn't afford, and to pursue them when they tried to disengage. That meant escorts could no longer act only like bodyguards glued to the bomber stream. They had to become predators. But the 8th Air Force couldn't simply decide this and make it real. The old limitations still sat at the center of everything: range. Fighters had to be able to reach the heart of Germany and still have the fuel to fight, to chase, and to return. That crucial resource, long-range fighters fitted with external tanks, was finally arriving in numbers by late January 1944. According to the Air University History Office, by that time the 8th Air Force had received sufficient P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts fitted with external fuel tanks to resume the deep bombing of Germany with full escort coverage, and Doolittle changed the concept by freeing fighters to attack enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground once the bombers reached the target area. The trap was being built, not with barbed wire, but with fuel and doctrine.
Drop tanks, the simplest-looking revolution.
To understand how radical this was, you have to understand the logistics behind those ugly little extras under a fighter's wings. External tanks were not just a bolt-on accessory. They were an industrial problem, a supply chain problem, a training problem, and a reliability problem. They had to be made in enormous numbers and delivered to airfields where every day burned through machines and men. Even the material mattered. In the strain of war, metal was precious. That's where one of the stranger artifacts of this campaign appears. Compressed paper drop tanks produced as a stopgap measure in Britain for USAAF aircraft while waiting for metal tanks from the United States. The Imperial War Museum's collection includes an example and notes it was produced for use by USAAF aircraft pending delivery of pressed aluminum tanks from America. Think about that for a moment. In a war of armor and steel, one of the keys to reaching Berlin involved tanks that could be partly made from paper. Not because paper was better, but because paper was available, and because in the logic of total war, anything that extends range without consuming strategic metal can become a weapon. For pilots, the drop tanks meant something immediate and visceral: time.
Options: a wider circle on the map.
The ability to escort a formation deep into Germany and still have fuel to mix it up when the Luftwaffe came. For German pilots, it meant something darker. The old escort boundary was no longer reliable. The prey no longer wandered into the forest alone. Big week, bait kill, and the sky filled with engines. The test of this new reality came in late February 1944. The Allies called it Operation Argument, a cold, bureaucratic name for a week of violence that would later be remembered as Big Week. The goal was blunt: smash German aircraft production and force the Luftwaffe to rise in defense, where it could be bled. The Americans would use the bombers as bait and the fighters as the killing mechanism, not just as escorts. From February 20th to 25th, Allied air forces flew thousands of sorties. The Air University History Office summarizes the scale and cost. By the end of Big Week, Allied air forces had flown about 6,000 sorties, losing 357 bombers and 28 escort fighters, with more than 2,000 airmen killed or captured. The Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters and 250 airmen killed or wounded, including about 100 pilots. Numbers are a kind of truth, but they never convey what it felt like inside the machine. Picture the climb out from England, the long spiral of heavy bombers gaining altitude, condensation streaming behind them, crews watching the sky for collisions because the formation is thick and the visibility can be thin. In at least some accounts of Big Week, commanders worried about weather and icing so much that it became a gamble simply getting thousands of aircraft into the air without disaster. Then the crossing. The North Sea or the Channel beneath, grey and indifferent. The first flak over the continent. The first sight of contrails from German fighters climbing up to meet them. And above the bomber stream, something the Luftwaffe had begun to fear, fighters that did not vanish when expected. The Air University History Office describes how German pilots were startled to see American fighters so deep into Germany, suddenly finding themselves pursued rather than simply intercepting at the time and place of their choosing. That word, startled, matters. Fighter pilots are not easily surprised. They live by anticipation.
Surprise is what kills you.
Big Week didn't eliminate the Luftwaffe in 7 days, but it pushed the system into a new shape. German units were forced to defend industrial targets again and again. And every defense mission meant exposure to escorts that could now follow longer, fight longer, and chase farther. For the Jagdwaffe, it was a kind of pressure test, one that began cracking the most fragile part of the German air defense: trained pilots.
A plane could be built. A veteran could not. The Luftwaffe learns the escorts let go.
The psychological shift for German pilots wasn't simply "the Mustang is good."
It was, "the Mustang stays."
And staying changed everything. In 1943, a German pilot could attack the bombers, break off, dive away, and often feel reasonably confident that the running fight would end once the escorts were forced to turn back. Even if he didn't escape clean, the geography and timing worked in his favor. But as escort range expanded, the old escape routes became dangerous. A fighter that disengaged could now be followed. A damaged aircraft could now be chased all the way to its airfield. A pilot returning low on fuel could now find American fighters hovering like wolves above the runway, waiting for the moment he was slow and vulnerable. This wasn't just a tactical inconvenience. It was a death sentence for a system built on repeated sorties by the same men. And the change began showing up in grim, specific moments. On March 2, 1944, for example, Luftwaffe ace and Geschwader Commodore Oberstleutnant Egon Mayer, credited with more than 100 victories on the Western Front, was killed when American fighters caught his formation, a reminder that even elite leaders were now vulnerable under the expanded escort umbrella. Accounts of the engagement vary in detail across sources, but the broad fact of Mayer's death that day is widely recorded. To the Luftwaffe's leadership, men like General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, responsible for the fighter force, this growing problem was existential. The German defense could not afford to lose seasoned pilots at a steady pace, especially as training pipelines deteriorated and fuel and aircraft availability tightened. Galland's conflicts with other leaders over how to fight the mounting Allied bomber offensive became one of the defining tensions of the air war in 1944. But the men in cockpits understood it in a simpler way. The sky was becoming hostile not just near the target, but on the way home. That was new. The road to Berlin becomes a test of nerve. By March 1944, the United States was ready to do something that had become a kind of obsession: hit Berlin in daylight in force. Berlin wasn't merely another target.
It was political, psychological, symbolic.
It was the city that made the Luftwaffe defend with everything it had. If you wanted to force German fighters into the air, Berlin did that almost automatically. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force puts the logic plainly: Berlin was chosen not only for its industry but because the Luftwaffe would be forced to defend it, suffering heavy losses. And so, on March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major raid against the German capital. The scale was enormous. According to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, 672 heavy bombers struck Berlin, and 69 were shot down. If you've never tried to imagine what losing 69 heavy bombers means, picture it as a city block of young men simply erased in one day. Each bomber carried a crew, 10 men on many B-17 missions. Not all losses mean all killed, but the human cost becomes staggering. American veterans would remember this mission as a kind of brutal milestone. Some accounts call it Black Monday for the 8th, a day when the price of reaching Berlin in daylight was paid in aircraft burning through the cold air. But what makes March 6 so important for our story isn't only the bomber loss figure. It's what the escort system looked like that day, and what it revealed.
The escort plan, a relay race through enemy sky. Berlin was deep.
Even with long-range fighters, escort coverage was not as simple as one group stays with you the whole way. A RAF study of the March 6 mission describes how escorting a deep penetration attack resembled a relay race, with fighter units moving out to join the bombers, then heading home after their stint, replaced by fresh units. The same document highlights a critical limitation. At any one time, only about 140 Allied fighters would be flying with the bombers, less than 1/6 of the number of escort sorties flown that day. Now add the other ugly fact: the bomber stream was 94 miles long. Spread those escorts evenly and you'd have almost nothing protecting any given slice of the formation, which would be tactically useless. The escort plan for March 6 involved nearly 700 P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s cycling through segments of the route, including RAF Mustangs joining at planned points. So March 6 was not yet the perfect Mustangs everywhere moment people sometimes imagine. It was still complicated, still strained, still a system doing its best to stretch over a vast distance. But the difference from 1943 was fundamental. The escort didn't simply stop near the border.
The relay reached deeper.
The Luftwaffe had fewer safe windows. And that fact alone forced German pilots to fight differently.
Inside the battle, what it felt like when the hunt reverses.
For a German interceptor pilot, a Berlin defense mission was not a single fight. It was a sequence of hazards. First, the scramble and climb. The cockpit fills with heat and engine vibration, while the world below shrinks into winter haze. You are climbing through layers of air where oxygen becomes thin and the cold becomes predatory, where a failed system or a small mistake can kill you without any enemy involved.
Second, the approach.
The bomber stream is so large it changes the sky. Condensation trails braid together, and sunlight flashes off hundreds of wings. Flak bursts punch black flowers through the formation, not always close enough to kill, but close enough to remind you that death is not selective.
Third, the pass.
You choose a line, commit, close at terrifying speed. Aiming is brutally short range because everything moves so fast, and then the defensive fire reaches out, white streaks, violent and constant. The B-17 is not a myth.
A well-flown formation is a fortress.
Then, the break and escape, except escape is no longer guaranteed. This is where Mustangs changed the emotional tone of the mission. When American fighters could follow you longer, the breakaway stopped being a clean ending and became a vulnerable transition. If you dove away, you might be pursued. If you climbed, you might be cut off. If you limped back low on fuel, you might find the enemy overhead. The Luftwaffe had spent 1943 believing it could bleed the bombers. In 1944, the Americans began trying to bleed the Luftwaffe instead. That did not mean the Luftwaffe suddenly collapsed. German pilots still inflicted heavy losses.
March 6 proves that.
Berlin was defended fiercely. But the long game was shifting, and German veterans could feel it. 2 days later, the number that terrified German planners. The Americans returned to Berlin 2 days later, on March 8, 1944, and the detail that jumps out is not simply the bombers.
It's the escorts.
According to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, the USAAF came back with 462 bombers escorted by 174 P-51s. Read that again, 174 Mustangs escorting a Berlin mission. That number is not a few fighters that happened to be there. That is a visible statement of intent. We can reach the capital with escort strength that isn't symbolic, it's operational. This is where pretty escort becomes the wrong insult. A fighter that can appear over Berlin en masse, with enough fuel to fight, is not decoration. It is a moving noose. It means German fighters must fight through escorts to reach bombers, and then fight again to survive the return. And when those Mustangs carried drop tanks, they were arriving with more than bullets. They were arriving with endurance. Why Berlin felt like a trap. In the Luftwaffe's earlier mental map, Germany was a fortress with depth. Even if you lost a fight over the target, you could disengage and rely on distance, friendly airspace, and known routes back to base. But once escorts can reach Berlin and keep fighting, depth becomes less comforting. Berlin also forced German fighters into the air in larger numbers, often drawing units from different regions, compressing the defense into corridors. The more crowded the sky becomes, the more chance of chaos. And chaos is where mistakes happen. Formation breaks, fuel miscalculations, navigation errors, collisions, lost pilots. From the American perspective, this was exactly what they wanted: compel the Luftwaffe to expose itself. From the German perspective, each major defense mission became a roll of the dice with stakes the Luftwaffe could not afford. This is why the phrase "Berlin into a trap" isn't just marketing. It's a structural truth about a defender forced to rise into battles that increasingly favored the attacker's replacement capacity. When an American pilot was lost, another could arrive from a pipeline backed by immense training infrastructure and industrial output. When a German veteran was lost, the Jagdwaffe lost not only a man but the accumulated instinct that kept units alive. By early 1944, German commanders were beginning to face a nightmare: the need to defend everything while knowing they could not preserve their best men.
The human cost behind the strategy shift.
It's tempting to treat this story as a clean arc. Mustang arrives, drop tanks appear, Luftwaffe collapses. History is uglier than that. The Mustang did not remove danger for American bomber crews overnight. Berlin on March 6 shows that, even with a new doctrine and longer range escorts, the bombers could still be cut and punished. And the escorts themselves were still mortal. A Mustang pilot could be shot down by flak, by a burst of cannon fire, by a single mistake in a turning fight. But the change was still real because it changed who had to carry the long-term burden. In 1943, American bomber crews carried the worst of it, long, deep missions where losses could be catastrophic and the Luftwaffe could concentrate attacks after the escorts left. In early 1944, the Americans began shifting the burden onto German fighter pilots by forcing them to fight repeatedly under worsening conditions, pursued longer and farther than their system was designed to endure. The Air University History Office notes that after Big Week, Allied air forces continued increasing in aircraft and pilots while the Luftwaffe struggled to replace growing losses, especially seasoned fighter pilots. That imbalance, replacement capacity versus experience loss, is the real engine of this story. And the Mustang, with drop tanks, was one of the tools that made it operational. A new kind of escort, and a new fear in German cockpits. By spring 1944, German pilots were living with a new fear that wasn't about the bombers' guns. It was about being followed. There is something uniquely terrifying about being hunted on the way home. Over the target you are tense, focused, prepared. On the return you are tired, low on fuel, perhaps damaged, perhaps navigating through cloud or haze. If an enemy fighter appears then, you are at your weakest. And the more Mustangs appeared deep over Germany, the more German pilots understood that the air war was changing from an interception battle into a pursuit battle. Not every German pilot would have described it in words, but many would have felt it in the tightening in their chest when they realized the escorts were still there. In 1943, they had laughed at the idea that escorts could stay. In 1944, they began checking their mirrors all the way down to the runway. Meanwhile, on English airfields, the Mustang was becoming what American bomber crews had prayed for, an escort that didn't wave goodbye at the worst moment. But even as American confidence grew, Berlin revealed a brutal truth. The Reich was not going to surrender the sky without a fight, and the Luftwaffe still had claws. And as the Americans pushed deeper, chasing the promise of air supremacy before the coming invasion of France, the Luftwaffe began searching for new answers, new tactics, new formations, even new aircraft that might restore the old balance. Because if Berlin could be reached with escorts, then nothing was safe. The Mustang did not win the air war by being faster in a brochure. It won by staying. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe had begun to sense that it was no longer fighting a series of isolated battles near targets. It was being dragged into a continuous contest of endurance, one it could not afford. And the cruelest part was this: the moment a German pilot turned for home, the war didn't end. Sometimes, that's when it began. On an American airfield in England, the change was visible in the smallest rituals. A pilot climbed into his P-51 and looked at the wings, not just for guns and ammunition, but for the extra fuel hanging beneath them. A ground crewman tugged at the fittings, checked the lines, then stepped back, as if confirming the aircraft had grown a second set of lungs. Somewhere in the briefing hut, a map was pinned up, and the radius circle, the old limit, had expanded.
You could almost feel the mood shift.
Bomber crews still carried the fear of flak and fire, but now there was something else mixed in, a cautious faith.
The escorts would be there.
Not just at the beginning, not just at the border, but deep into enemy sky. And if the Luftwaffe came for them, the fighters would not simply block the blow. They would go looking for the fist.
The first drop tank decision, and the moment the sky goes quiet.
Every long-range escort mission had a moment that felt like a personal gamble. It came when the Mustang pilot looked up at the bomber stream, then down at his fuel gauges, and then out toward the distant haze that marked Germany. Drop tanks gave range, but they also added drag. In a turning fight, drag could be the difference between winning and dying. So most pilots dropped the tanks before combat. That meant you had to choose the moment. Drop too early, and you might run out of fuel on the way back, or lose the ability to escort deeper than planned. Drop too late, and you might enter a fight with extra weight and reduced performance. Either way, there was no perfect answer, only a decision, and then consequences. And the strangest part was what came right before it. Sometimes the sky would go quiet. Not quiet in sound, engines never let the air become silent, but quiet in tension. A formation would settle into cruise. Clouds would thin. The bomber stream would stretch ahead like a migrating continent, and for a brief stretch of time, nothing moved except the slow, relentless eastward drift of thousands of men and machines. This was the moment German pilots waited for. They believed the escorts would turn back. They believed the bombers would soon be alone. They would climb and gather and prepare to strike. But now, instead of watching American fighters peel away, they found themselves staring at something worse. Escorts still there, high and patient, hanging like a promise of violence. The old gap was shrinking. And in that shrinking gap, the Luftwaffe had to adapt. How the Jagdwaffe tried to solve the Mustang problem. The Luftwaffe's problem was not that German aircraft suddenly became bad. Many German fighters were formidable, especially in experienced hands. The problem was that the Germans were being forced to fight on terms that punished them over time. So German commanders tried to change the terms. One approach was to hit the bombers harder and faster. Head-on attacks, massed attacks, rockets and heavy cannon meant to break formations and force bombers to scatter. Another approach was to create specialized bomber-destroyer units, fighters modified for close-range killing power, often heavily armed and sometimes armored. By 1944, some FW-190 units were equipped with heavy cannon packages intended to smash bombers at close range, accepting that such aircraft would be slower and less agile. This kind of attacker could be deadly against bombers, but it was also exactly the kind of aircraft that a Mustang loved to find once it was separated from its protective cloud of friends. Because the Mustang's strength was not only speed or turn rate, it was flexibility.
It could escort, then hunt.
It could climb to intercept, then dive to chase. It could choose fights more often than German pilots could. So the Luftwaffe tried grouping fighters into tight, mutually supporting formations to repel escorts and reach the bombers. They tried to use altitude advantages. They tried to time interceptions so the bombers were hit at moments when escorts were transitioning, when a relay swap was occurring, when some fighters were leaving and others arriving. And for a while, it worked often enough to keep the bomber war bloody. But the attrition was eating them alive. A Luftwaffe pilot who survived 1940 and 1941 had likely become good in a way that is hard to quantify, an instinct for when to commit and when to break, for how to see the sky as geometry and time. Those were the men the Luftwaffe could not replace. The Americans, by contrast, were expanding. Training pipelines were improving.
New groups arrived.
Aircraft availability climbed. And as the fighter arm gained range, it began to do something German pilots hadn't fully expected. It began to visit them at home. The new terror, being attacked near the airfield. A German fighter pilot's world had once been organized around a comforting idea: the airfield was sanctuary. You might be chased, you might be damaged, you might limp back in a smoking aircraft, but once you crossed your own territory and came down toward your own runway, the worst was supposed to be behind you.
In 1944, that comfort eroded.
Escorts that could remain deep into Germany could also linger near known Luftwaffe bases and attack aircraft during takeoff and landing, moments when a fighter is least able to defend itself. A pilot low on fuel, low on altitude, and committed to a landing pattern has almost no options if an enemy fighter pounces. The effect of this was not just physical destruction. It was psychological pressure. It meant every mission had a second phase, the return. It meant pilots could not mentally relax after breaking off from bombers. It meant damaged aircraft had to fly lower, faster, and more desperately, because the threat of pursuit remained. And it also meant something even more corrosive: Luftwaffe units had to spend time defending their own airfields and infrastructure, not just intercepting bombers.
Defense gets spread thin.
Response becomes frantic. This is how air superiority grows, not only by winning dogfights, but by forcing the enemy to spend his strength just trying to survive. The Mustang's quiet advantage: time over target, and time over Germany. When Americans talk about the Mustang, they often talk about it like a duelist's blade: sleek, sharp, elegant, a weapon that outclassed its opponent. But in the escort war, the Mustang was more like a clock. It gave the Americans more minutes in the right place. More minutes over the bomber stream. More minutes near the target. More minutes between German fighters and their home bases. And those extra minutes, enabled by external fuel, compounded into something bigger than any single engagement. A German fighter unit might scramble, climb, intercept, attack, then break off. In 1943, that might have been the end.
In 1944, it could become the middle.
Mustangs could follow the break, press the chase, and force a German pilot to fight again while already low on fuel and endurance. Each additional minute the Mustangs stayed above Germany increased the chance that a German pilot would make a mistake, would misjudge fuel, would dive too steeply, would get separated, would be caught. And the Luftwaffe's margin for error was shrinking.
Aces, legends, and the truth behind them.
In every air war, stories of aces spread faster than official reports. On the American side, fighter groups developed reputations that felt like myth. The 4th Fighter Group, originally formed from former Eagle Squadron pilots, carried a kind of swagger and hard-earned skill. Other groups built their own identities: units that specialized in close escort, units that excelled at aggressive sweeps, units that produced names the newspapers loved. German pilots had their own legends too, men who had fought from the opening years and accumulated scores that seemed unreal, partly because the Eastern Front and Western Front created different conditions and because German pilots often flew far more combat sorties than Allied pilots. But by 1944, even legends began to feel mortal. Not because their skill vanished, but because the sky was becoming crowded with enemies who could stay longer, fight more often, and return tomorrow with fresh pilots and new aircraft.
A Luftwaffe ace could still kill. He could still outfly an opponent.
But the strategic environment was shifting beneath him, like ice thinning underfoot. And this matters because wars are not decided by one brilliant dogfight. They are decided by whether a force can keep fighting week after week without breaking. The Luftwaffe began to break in slow motion. The strategic pressure behind the drama, why the Allies needed this before D-Day. This story is not only about pride in cockpits or the romance of fighter aircraft.
It is also about a countdown.
In 1944, the Western Allies were preparing for the invasion of France, an operation that would require control of the air. Not absolute control in a fantasy sense, but enough dominance that Allied ships and troops could move without being shredded by German air attacks. The lesson of earlier amphibious operations was clear. If the enemy could mass air power over your beaches, your invasion could become a massacre. So the air war over Germany was not just punishment, it was preparation. Every German fighter shot down, every veteran pilot lost, every airfield damaged, every aircraft factory disrupted. These were steps toward a day when Allied soldiers would step onto European soil and not be annihilated from above. The bomber offensive was still costly, still controversial, still imperfect. But it was increasingly tied to a strategic objective that even skeptical commanders could not ignore: reduce the Luftwaffe to a state where it could not meaningfully interfere with the invasion. That is why the Mustang's arrival mattered so much. It wasn't merely a better escort. It was a tool that made the larger plan possible.
The Luftwaffe's counterpunch, bomber destroyers and desperate tactics.
As the escorts grew stronger, German defenses leaned harder into blunt force. They experimented with rocket attacks aimed at disrupting bomber formations, firing salvos into the stream, hoping to force bombers to break and create gaps. They fielded heavily armed fighters intended to kill bombers with a few bursts of cannon fire. Some units adopted close-range tactics that were brutally dangerous, approached to within point-blank distance and fire until the bomber structure failed. From the bomber crew's perspective, these attacks could feel like being charged by something that didn't care if it died. A fighter coming straight at you head-on at closing speeds that allow only seconds to react. This was a nightmare because it challenged the gunner's ability to track and the pilot's ability to hold formation under panic. But these tactics carried a terrible trade-off. The more the Luftwaffe specialized in bomber killing, the more vulnerable it became to the escorts. A heavily armored fighter might kill bombers more effectively, but it was often less agile. It couldn't always escape Mustangs. It couldn't always climb away. And if it lost its escort cover or got separated, it became prey. So the Luftwaffe could win moments and still lose the long war. This is the hidden tragedy of air combat. You can do everything right and still be on the wrong side of the arithmetic.
The American fighter sweep, turning escort into pursuit.
The most dramatic expression of the new philosophy was the fighter sweep. Instead of hugging the bombers, some fighter elements would range ahead to break up German formations as they assembled. Others would ride above as top cover, ready to pounce on interceptors. Others still would drop down to strafe targets of opportunity: airfields, trains, fuel depots, aircraft caught on the ground. This was controversial. Bomber commanders hated the idea of fighters leaving their immediate vicinity, because they had seen what happened when escorts were absent. But Doolittle's logic was simple: the bombers would never be safe as long as the Luftwaffe remained a coherent fighting force. The escorts had to break it. And the Mustang made it possible to do this deep in Germany, not only near the coast. A German pilot climbing to intercept could now find Mustangs already waiting above his intended route. He could be hit before he even reached the bombers. Or he could be forced to fight the escorts first, burning fuel and altitude, arriving late and tired to the bomber stream, if he arrived at all. This is how Berlin becomes a trap in operational terms. The deeper the raids went, the more they pulled the Luftwaffe into large-scale defenses, and the more the escorts were able to engage and chase those defenses in a way that kept attrition high. Meanwhile below, German civilians and the sound of inevitability. It's easy to tell this story from cockpits alone, but the air war was also a civilian experience. By 1944, German cities had lived under bombing for years. Sirens, shelters, smoke, fire, these were not new. But there was a growing sense, recorded in diaries and post-war recollections, of the air war becoming constant. Day raids, night raids, the feeling that the sky no longer belonged to Germany. For civilians, the appearance of large American formations in daylight carried its own message. It suggested confidence, not fear. It suggested the Allies could come when they wanted. And when fighters began fighting not only over targets but along routes and near bases, the war spread into the air across regions that had once seen only distant echoes. From the ground, you might see a dogfight overhead and not know who was winning, only that aircraft were falling, that the sky was filled with contrails and black flak bursts, that the war had become something you could look up at and watch.
It is a cruel spectacle.
Beautiful in shape, horrifying in meaning. The turning of the tide isn't clean, and Berlin still bleeds. Even as American escorts improved, Berlin missions and other deep raids continued to exact heavy losses.
The Luftwaffe could still mass fighters.
Flak was still murderous. Weather still scattered formations.
Mechanical failures still killed crews.
The narrative temptation is to treat 1944 as a victory march.
It wasn't.
It was a grinding transition where the Allies slowly gained the upper hand, and the Luftwaffe tried desperately to keep up, often paying with the lives of its most experienced men. German leaders argued about tactics and priorities. Should fighters stay close to defend cities? Should they pursue bomber formations far from targets? Should new aircraft be prioritized? Should resources be shifted to jets? Should flak and fighters coordinate differently? These questions mattered, but they were increasingly constrained by shortages, fuel shortages, production disruptions, and the shrinking pool of men who could fly at that level.
And the Americans, too, paid.
Every mission still meant empty chairs in briefing rooms, telegrams to families, aircraft that didn't return. But the balance was changing. Not with a single heroic moment, but with a slow tightening of pressure.
The cliff edge, one more push, and the war changes shape.
By late spring 1944, the air war was becoming something the Luftwaffe could no longer control. The Allies were not just reaching deep targets. They were contesting the entire airspace over Germany in daylight. And the timing mattered more than ever. Across the Channel, an invasion force was building: ships, landing craft, tanks, trucks, ammunition, and men. The Germans could sense it. They didn't know the exact date, but they knew a blow was coming. For the Allies, the question was urgent: could they suppress the Luftwaffe enough that the invasion would not be met by mass German air attacks? For the Luftwaffe, the question was existential: could they preserve enough strength to strike when the invasion began? Every escort mission, every Berlin raid, every fighter sweep was now part of a countdown that would end on a beach. And in the cockpits of Mustangs fitted with drop tanks, American pilots were beginning to understand the terrifying simplicity of their task. Stay with the bombers.
Break the interceptors. Keep the pressure on.
Because when the invasion started, there would be no second chance. And somewhere in Germany, a Luftwaffe pilot looked at his dwindling fuel, felt the weight of the day's losses, and realized that the Americans were not just visiting the Reich anymore. They were moving in, leaving trails of steaming vapor in their wake. That's how the US government newsreel narrator framed it: American bombers climbing high, heading for Berlin, the sky behind them stitched with white lines like seams on a vast canvas. From the ground, it looked almost clean, almost graceful. From inside a B-17, it was a long vibrating corridor of fear: oxygen masks, intercom crackle, the smell of cold metal and sweat inside electrically heated suits, and the knowledge that Berlin wasn't just another dot on the map. Berlin was the dot that made the Luftwaffe show its teeth. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major maximum effort daylight raid on the German capital. 672 heavy bombers struck Berlin, and 69 were shot down. That single line contains the whole contradiction of the new era. The Americans could now reach Berlin in force, yet the price was still brutal enough to fill English airfields with empty parking stands and silence in briefing rooms. But what mattered, what truly changed the feeling of the war in the cockpit, wasn't only the bomber losses. It was what flew above and around those bombers: fighters that did not turn back when German pilots expected them to. The old line in the sky was fading. The moment protection became pursuit. In the previous year, the Luftwaffe had built its defense around timing.
Let the American escorts peel away, then hit the bombers in the deep interior.
It was cruel, efficient, and for a time it worked. It turned the air war into a scheduled ambush. By early 1944, the Americans were done being ambushed. General Jimmy Doolittle, newly in command of the 8th Air Force, made a decision that was part strategy, part philosophy, part cold arithmetic. The famous story, repeated because it captures the pivot so clearly, takes place in Major General William Kepner's office at 8 Fighter Command. A sign read: "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle ordered it taken down and replaced with: "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." To bomber crews, this sounded almost like betrayal. They had watched friends die in the escort gap. They had clung to fighters as if they were oxygen. The idea of escorts leaving them, even for a good reason, felt like a return to the nightmare. But Doolittle wasn't chasing comfort. He was chasing an ending. The bomber offensive could not survive forever at 1,943 loss rates. The Luftwaffe had to be broken as a fighting force. Not merely pushed away from a formation for a few minutes, but worn down until it could no longer rise in strength, no longer coordinate, no longer replace its dead and missing veterans. That meant escort fighters had to do something they had rarely been allowed to do in daylight bomber doctrine. They had to roam. And roaming required one thing more than courage: fuel.
Drop tanks, the unglamorous key to Berlin.
A fighter pilot can be fearless and still be trapped by physics. Range is the tyrant of air war. It decides where you can fight and when you must leave. In 1943, the Luftwaffe's best ally wasn't only skill or flak or radar, it was the fuel gauge in an American escort fighter. By 1944, the Allies were solving that problem with a piece of equipment so plain it almost feels insulting to call it decisive: external fuel tanks, carried under wings or belly, used on the outward leg, then dropped when empty so the fighter could fight clean. Sometimes those tanks were aluminum. Sometimes, because war eats metal like a furnace, they were something stranger. The Imperial War Museum's collection holds an example of a compressed paper 108-gallon drop tank, produced in Britain for USAAF aircraft as a stopgap while waiting for pressed aluminum tanks from the United States. A paper tank sounds like a punchline until you realize what it represents: an entire industrial society improvising to push fighters farther into enemy sky. The tank didn't need to survive forever. It needed to survive long enough.
One mission.
One escort leg. One more reach toward Berlin. That's what the Luftwaffe felt in their bones as Mustangs stayed with the bomber stream longer than expected. Not just staying, sometimes slipping ahead, high and fast, turning German assembly points into danger zones. Big Week taught both sides the new rules. 2 weeks before Berlin, the Allies ran a rehearsal for this new kind of war in the air, Operation Argument, remembered as Big Week. The aim was not subtle.
Smash aircraft production, force the Luftwaffe to rise in defense, then tear it down in the air.
It was the bomber offensive used as bait, and the fighter force used as the knife. By the end of Big Week, Allied air forces flew roughly 6,000 sorties, losing 357 bombers and 28 escort fighters, with more than 2,000 airmen killed or captured. The Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters and 250 airmen killed or wounded, including about 100 pilots. Those numbers are often quoted because they capture scale, but the deeper story is what those numbers did to the Luftwaffe's internal reality. Germany could build fighters, but trained fighter pilots, men who knew how to climb into contrails, judge closure speed, fire for effect, then escape, were harder to replace, especially as fuel and training hours shrank. Big Week wasn't just a series of raids. It was a signal that the Americans had stopped trying merely to survive the Luftwaffe and had started trying to destroy it. And then Berlin put that signal over the capital.
March 6, 1944, Berlin, and the taste of a trap.
The Berlin raid hit like a hammer because it forced the Luftwaffe to do what it could least afford: fight in mass repeatedly, under growing escort pressure. On that day, German pilots still killed bombers in painful numbers. The capital was defended fiercely. The Luftwaffe was not yet a broken force. But the escort environment around the bomber stream had changed in a way that felt personal. Not just more fighters.
Not just better fighters. Something worse.
Fighters that could follow you farther. For a Luftwaffe pilot, the old rhythm had a mercy in it. You attacked, you broke, and if you lived, you returned through friendly airspace that gradually became safer as distance increased. Now distance was less comforting.
The long way home used to be a kind of shield.
In 1944 it became a corridor where you could be hunted while low on fuel, tired, and sometimes damaged. And the Germans began to adapt not only with tactics but with a kind of tightening desperation. They tried heavier armament, cannon meant to rip apart bombers with fewer passes. They tried rockets to disrupt formations. They formed specialized bomber-destroyer elements, attempting to strike hard and then escape. But those heavier, more specialized aircraft paid a price in agility and stamina. An aircraft built to kill bombers quickly is often less suited to surviving a prolonged fight with escorts, which was exactly the kind of fight the Americans were now trying to force.
The American escorts learned to be wolves.
A fighter sweep is a predatory concept. Instead of clinging to the bomber formation like armor, fighters range ahead, searching for the enemy before the enemy can reach the bombers. They hit interceptors as they climb, break up formations as they gather, chase them as they run. This was the controversial heart of Doolittle's change. Bomber crews, understandably, wanted escorts near enough to touch. Fighter leaders argued they could do more by attacking the Luftwaffe's ability to organize, because every German fighter forced into a defensive turn, every interceptor shot down while forming up, was one less threat to the bomber stream. In practice, escort missions became layered. Some fighters stayed close, especially during the most dangerous segments. Some ranged ahead and above, looking for German formations. Some, on the return leg, began dropping down to strafe targets of opportunity, airfields, trains, parked aircraft, because the goal was no longer only to protect bombers but to collapse the German air system. This wasn't just aggression. It was preparation for the invasion. The Allies needed the Luftwaffe suppressed so thoroughly that when the landings came, German aircraft could not mass over the beaches. And that's where the Mustangs' range became more than a tactical advantage. It became a strategic clock. More time over Germany meant more chances to catch German fighters climbing. More chances to chase them home. More chances to strike airfields. More chances, ultimately, to thin the Luftwaffe's veteran corps. The airfield problem, sanctuary becomes a killing zone. There is a particular cruelty in attacking an aircraft at takeoff or landing. A fighter is most vulnerable when it is slow, heavy, and committed to a runway. It cannot simply dive away. It cannot always maneuver. If it is hit, then it may never even get the chance to fight. As escort range improved, the Luftwaffe began to face a nightmare. American fighters appearing not only along bomber routes but near German airfields, sometimes catching pilots as they returned low on fuel, or striking aircraft on the ground. This is where the word trap becomes more than metaphor. A defense built around scramble, climb, intercept, return, repeat, begins to crack if the return is no longer safe. If every sortie carries a second, hidden risk, pilot fatigue becomes fear.
Fear becomes hesitation. Hesitation becomes death.
Meanwhile, American fighter units had a new kind of confidence. They could escort deeper and still have the fuel to fight, to chase, and to return. That extra fuel, often carried in external tanks, was not glamorous. But it turned the Mustang into something the Luftwaffe could not comfortably escape.
The paper tank, falling like a blunt comet. Imagine the moment from a Mustang cockpit.
You're high above Germany. The bomber stream is ahead, silver lines and contrails. The Luftwaffe might appear any minute. Your external tanks are nearly empty.
They've done their job.
Then you reach down, gloved hands, stiff fingers, and pull the release. The drop tank falls away, tumbling end over end, a dull shape against the countryside far below. In some cases, those tanks were built to break apart on impact, denying scrap. They were expendable by design. It's an odd image of war, a fighter shedding the thing that gave it range, casting it away like a skin, and instantly becoming sharper, faster, more dangerous. And somewhere below, civilians might see the falling object and flinch, mistaking it for a bomb. War teaches the eye to fear anything that falls from the sky. The Mustang, unburdened now, could fight like it was built to fight.
Industry versus experience. The real contest underneath the dogfights.
By spring 1944, the air war was not merely a contest of planes. It was a contest of replacement capacity. The United States could replace aircraft and train new pilots at a scale Germany could not match. Germany, by contrast, relied heavily on an experienced cadre of fighter leaders and veterans. Losing them was catastrophic in a way that did not show up immediately on a production chart. And the Allies were now hunting that experience. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey later described the shift in early 1944 in blunt, institutional terms. With the protection of long-range fighter escort, the culminating attacks against German aircraft plants began in late February 1944, and every known aircraft plant in Germany was hit in that and succeeding weeks. That is the strategic backbone behind the emotion in cockpits. The escort wasn't just saving bombers. It was enabling sustained pressure at a depth the Luftwaffe had not been forced to endure before. And Berlin was the symbol of that depth. But the Luftwaffe wasn't dead yet. Here is what the most dramatic stories sometimes get wrong. The Luftwaffe didn't simply vanish the moment Mustangs reached Berlin.
It fought.
It fought with skill, with courage, and increasingly with desperation. It adapted with heavier armament, different formations, and fierce concentrations of defense.
And the Americans still lost bombers.
They still lost fighters. Weather still scattered formations.
Flags still tore through wings.
Engines still failed. Men still froze at altitude, still bled in cramped compartments, still jumped into the sky praying the parachute would open. Yet the direction of the war in the air was shifting. Not because the Mustang was magic, but because the Mustang, equipped for range, arrived at the exact moment American leadership decided fighters should stop thinking like shields and start thinking like hunters.
The countdown to the beaches.
By late spring, everything in the air war began to feel like a countdown. Across England, the south coast was thick with men and vehicles. Airfields were crowded.
Briefings were constant.
The invasion was coming. Everyone knew it, even if they didn't know the date. The Allies needed to reach a moment where German aircraft could not gather in strength over the landing zones. That meant not only winning battles over Germany, but exhausting the Luftwaffe's ability to respond at all. And that meant the escort war had to continue, day after day, until the German fighter arm was not merely bruised but strangled. Meanwhile, German planners stared at their own shrinking margins and looked for something, anything, that could change the equation. They dispersed factories. They tried new tactics. They leaned harder on flak. They dreamed of wonder weapons. And in the background, like a rumor turning into a shadow, the Allies heard about something that could be worse than any piston-engine fighter.
A German jet.
American official historians would later write that in early 1944 the enemy had a new jet-propelled fighter, which might appear in the skies any day, and which was expected to outperform Allied aircraft. That sentence carried a chill. Because it hinted at a brutal possibility. What if the Luftwaffe was losing the escort war, but was about to re-enter the sky with a weapon that rewrote the rules? And if that happened, then all of this, Berlin drop tanks, the slow strangling of the Jagdwaffe, might become the prelude to something even more dangerous. The Mustangs were turning Berlin into a trap. But somewhere on a German airfield, under camouflage nets and guarded secrecy, another kind of aircraft was beginning to warm up, one that did not need drop tanks to be fast. And the next phase of the air war would test whether the Allies had gained supremacy in time, or whether the sky still had one last shock waiting.